The United States of America stands alone as the only nation in the world that sentences people to life without the possibility of parole for crimes committed before turning 18. It's difficult to keep the emotions out of this issue, as the kids that are being convicted are just that, kids. But should they not pay for their crimes, considering the seriousness of some of their offenses? In any case, being a teenager and being told that you will never be free again must be a completely earth-shattering moment. There's a clear before and after a kid hears that famous word, guilty. For better or for worse, teenagers being sent to jail for life happens all the time. From an incredibly irresponsible and lethal driver to a young man that either deserves an Oscar nomination or around-the-clock psychiatric care, here are 20 teenage convicts reacting to life sentences. Number 20. Jacob Muzzin and Drake Campbell reaction of crying in court. Actions have consequences. We all heard this sentence at least once in our young days. In the case of the 18-year-old Jacob Muzzin and 17-year-old Drake Campbell, a judge had to remind them that it's not just a saying. And this is how this teen reacted after hearing his sentence. Armed robbery, burglary, murder, and attempted murder. These are the horrible crimes the two young men were charged with. Kadeem Johnson and his girlfriend were returning to their home in Huger, South Carolina. A group of 5 men were lurking inside their house, amongst them the 2 teenagers. The suspects found $3,000 in cash and decided to tear the house apart. But at the sight of the couple returning home unexpectedly, things took an even more horrific turn. First, they put the couple down to their knees and duct taped their hands. Then they shot Kadeem Johnson in an execution-style murder. They also shot the girlfriend in the hands and chest, leaving her for dead. It took 4 law enforcement agencies to apprehend the suspects a few days later. The 2 teenagers' family members tried to plead a more clement ruling in front of the judge, but it's when Jacob heard he was given 40 years in prison and Drake 20, they both broke into tears. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Number 19. Dylan Schumacher convicted of second-degree murder. Despite his young age at the time, Dylan Schumacher committed one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. At 16 years old, the teenager was left babysitting his girlfriend's son. That same day, the 23-month-old toddler was found dead after a gruesome attack by the teenager. While facing the judge, Dylan insisted that he did not intend to kill Austin, but clearly, the judge, along with the jurors and the Supreme Court, found it very hard to believe. Based on the suspect's testimony and the documents presented to the court, it all started when Dylan spanked and slapped the toddler's face after spitting his food. Later, he also admitted slamming the boy's head on the floor while changing his diaper and punching his face multiple times while placing a pillow on his head. He was afraid that the boy would wake up his baby brother, Dylan said. Charged and convicted of murder and child abuse, Dylan was sentenced to 25 to life since then. And whether it's because of the sentencing itself or because of real or staged remorse, Dylan couldn't stop crying in the courtroom. But the judge himself called the teenager a manipulator and a deceiver and insisted that the last minutes of Austin's life must have been terrifying. Number 18. Lindsay Sentence raising questions. At 16 years old, Nicholas Lindsay was pulled over by a cop responding to a reported possible car break-in nearby. When the 46-year-old police veteran stepped out to talk with Lindsay, the teenager shot him 5 times, causing the officer's death. At that time, the jury found the teenager guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to a life in prison without parole. 1 year later, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling it unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to life without parole, the legislature passed a law pushing judges to take into consideration the suspect's age and the possibilities for rehabilitation. So, based on this new opportunity, Lindsay's attorneys appealed for a reduced sentence from a life sentence to 40 years in prison. The defense justified the appeal based on the fact that Lindsay had obtained his GED and attended other classes in prison, trying to show it as clear signs of rehabilitation. But prosecutors presented evidence that also during that time, Lindsay was found with contraband and was involved in fighting and cutting another inmate's face. His violent behavior has continued since the murder, said the judge while sentencing Lindsay to life without parole for a second time, a decision that left Lindsay smirking in front of the judge while hearing it. Number 17. Teen accused of setting fire that killed brother cries. After 5 hours of investigations and several years later after the events, this case still brings up more questions than actual answers. Matt Morgan was left babysitting his 14-month-old brother at their trailer park, and a few days later, he was charged with murder and arson. The prosecutors based their case on circumstantial evidence and the 5-hour interrogation the teenager went through. The investigators insisted that the 17-year-old intentionally started 2 different fires that led to the death of his brother. The first one by dropping a candle on a blanket in the baby's room, and the second one in the living room by lighting a pillow on fire. They also claim he stood still outside watching the trailer park take fire while his brother was inside and without asking for help or even trying to help himself, insisting that he confessed being fascinated by the fire. But at the same time, Matt's parents were claiming that he was intimidated into confessing. They insist he has developmental delays and autism, and he's always had problems reading, writing, and understanding commands. Matt was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and when he heard his sentence, he collapsed to tears to the point that bailiffs had to lift him up off the floor. Number 16. Philip Kism accused of murdering teacher. At 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, the 14-year-old Philip Kism was reported missing from his school after not showing up to soccer practice. At 11 p.m. that same day, the 24-year-old teacher Colleen Ritzer was also reported missing. As both disappearances seemed suspicious, the police started to investigate, and so, quickly, they found the teacher's deceased body. Less than 2 hours later, the police found Kism walking on the side of the road. In his backpack, they found a box cutter with blood, the teacher's ID, her credit cards, and women's underwear. When he was asked whose blood it was, he said it's the girl's. It appears that Kism followed his teacher into a school bathroom wearing gloves and a hood. He assaulted her sexually and stabbed her 16 times before leaving by himself 12 minutes later. Kism then came back with a recycling barrel to transport the body into the woods near the school with a note saying, "I hate you all." Being unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to life without parole, 2 years later, Kism didn't seem to flinch when sentenced to 40 years in prison for robbing, killing, and raping Colleen Ritzer. Number 15. Jodi Arias admits to killing her boyfriend. In June 2008, Travis Alexander's friends called 911 after finding his body in his bathroom. Alexander was shot in the forehead, had around 30 knife wounds, and his throat was slit from ear to ear. When talking to the police, the friends mentioned Jodi Arias as Alexander's girlfriend. A month later, Arias is arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder of her deceased boyfriend. The trial and investigation lasted over 5 years, during which Jodi's testimonies of the event showcased a variety of versions of what might have happened that day. At first, she pled not guilty, denying killing Alexander during a public interview she gave to the press. Then, she started admitting to being present during what she claimed was a home invasion that led to the horrific murder. After that, she started shifting her story into a self-defense act, but she had no memory of stabbing him. She submitted private letters as proof of a sexually abusive ex-boyfriend. She even took a stand in court as her own witness to prove her theory. But prosecutors insisted that Alexander was the one defending himself until his body gave up. Finding her guilty of the hideous crime, the jurors determined she was eligible for the death penalty, but the judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Number 14. Fernando Salgado. While facing jail time for attempted sexual assault by a foreign object, the 18-year-old Fernando Salgado broke into tears in court in California. While he was begging the judges not to go back to jail awaiting his sentencing, his family also disrupted the court to make the same plea as the bail was set at $200,000. The teenager was accused of trying to sexually assault another student with a piece of rebar. A few days later, against the advice of his own attorney, the teenager accepted to sign a plea agreement for lesser charges in exchange of testifying against his teacher, De La Rosa. Prosecutors said the teacher may have authorized the assault and even participated in the hazing. By signing the plea deal, Salgado will be facing the assault with a deadly weapon charges and will be able to withdraw his plea on the attempted sexual penetration as long as he truthfully testifies in court against his teacher. Thanks to the plea bargain deal and testimony, Salgado was able to reduce his sentencing from up to 4 years in prison and being registered as a sex offender to 180 days in jail on weekends and staying on probation for 3 years. Number 13. David Moses. Yawning, laughing, smirking, even clearly falling asleep in his chair. This is how David Moses was reacting to his sentencing to life in prison. Moses suffered physical, verbal, and emotional abuse during his childhood, and at 17 years old, he was already on juvenile probation for sexually assaulting a total of 9 kids on different occasions. But it's only when a burglary caused the death of the 81-year-old Dorothy Session that he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. David, with 2 other girls, broke into Sessions' house thinking it was empty, but when coming face to face with the 81-year-old that was making herself dinner, they brutally assaulted her, punching her in the face multiple times, leaving her completely disfigured and bleeding to death. Moses' attorney tried to plead for a sentence of 25 to life, evidencing the traumatic childhood his client had suffered and the immaturity of a 17-year-old. But how mature do you have to be to realize that beating up a little old lady's wrong, said the prosecutor. Mr. Moses received the punishment he deserved, he added after the judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Number 12. Psycho teenager TJ Lane. TJ Lane first became known to the public in 2012 for his hideous school shooting perpetrated in Ohio. The 17-year-old left 3 dead and 4 others wounded, one of them paralyzed from the waist down. When the police found him about a mile from the school, he was wearing a t-shirt with the word killer on it. And despite admitting he shot the victims in the head because, according to him, he didn't want them to suffer, he still pleaded not guilty. He also admitting to having a .22 caliber and a knife with him and firing 10 shots at a group of students sitting by the cafeteria. In court, TJ not only didn't show any remorse for his actions, but he also wore a t-shirt at his sentencing with the word killer. And as if that weren't enough, he didn't stop smirking, smiling, and even threw up the middle finger at the victims' relatives. Needless to say, he was then found guilty and was charged with 3 life sentences without parole. But TJ's horrendous race for criminal notoriety didn't stop there. 2 years later, he escaped from prison along with 2 other inmates, but luckily he was captured about 100 yards from the prison's location. Number 11. Teenager murdered his great-grandmother. Antonio Barbeau was found guilty for first-degree murder at the age of 13. The teenager killed his own great-grandmother at her house with a hatchet and a hammer. Barbeau didn't act alone. He had an accomplice, another 13-year-old boy. After taking the life of the 78-year-old Barbara Olson, they stole her cash, ordered pizza, and bought weed. Both Barbeau and his accomplice were sentenced to life, and they won't be eligible for parole until they are 50 years old. When journalists asked Barbeau's attorney if he was genuinely remorseful for what he did, he said, "Yes, he is. I don't doubt that." But as some of Barbeau's family members asked the judge to reduce the parole eligibility to 25 years, others insisted to journalists that even if he won't necessarily go out when he's 50, he will still have to prove he's worthy of becoming a member of society. During his sentencing, Barbeau broke into tears while addressing the judge, saying, "I know that I don't show my emotions much," but he also appeared shaking his head with a smile when the prosecutor started speaking. Number 10. The Laughing Teenager. Donta Wright's behavior in court got the judge himself to take a moment to lecture the 17-year-old in front of everybody. Wright and 2 other people have pleaded guilty to the murder of the 18-year-old Jordan Clee. The teenager admitted that while they were trying to rob their victim, he was the one who shot and killed Jordan. In the case presented by the prosecutors, they tried to show Donta as a gang affiliate, saying that the gang was rapping about the teenager's lifestyle. Wright's mother kept claiming her son's innocence. "I can't stop him from not wanting to snitch on anybody," she said in front of the judge. But Wright's unconscious defiance towards the law didn't stop there. Facing second-degree murder charges, he kept smiling and laughing during his sentencing, and didn't stop smiling when the victim's family members were reading their impact statements in front of the court. But when the teenager had a chance to address himself to the court, he said, smiling, "I just want to tell y'all I'll be home soon. I love my family."
I just want to tell y'all I'll be home soon, or I'll be Keon. I love my family.
Words and behavior that almost made the judge refuse the sentencing agreement and take the case to trial. Ultimately, the teenager was charged with 23 to 50 years in prison. Number 9. Jaleel Smith Riley breaks down in tears at sentencing. In a case that lasted 3 years, Smith Riley broke down in tears when he heard his sentencing. Jaleel Smith Riley first pleaded guilty to the murder of Portia Brooks and admitted injuring her boyfriend Martin in Norwood in 2013. The couple was in a parked car at the time, and according to the police, when Smith Riley didn't find anything to rob from the couple, he shot Martin in the head first and then leaned to shoot Portia. Brooks died 3 days after the incident, while her boyfriend survived. Probably trying to avoid the death penalty, Smith Riley surprised his own attorneys by requesting from the judge to withdraw his plea to not guilty. After taking into consideration the withdrawal request, the judge denied it but took the death penalty off the table. During the hearing, Smith Riley kept apologizing for what he did, saying that he made a mistake.
I'm so sorry.
His family and defense attorney tried to plead for a sentence with parole, saying that he had no prior conviction and to give him the possibility for rehabilitation. The judge ended up sentencing him to life in prison without parole, which brought Smith Riley to collapse in tears. Number 8. Franklin Williams. Franklin Williams' behavior during his sentencing hearing made the judge recuse himself from the case, which forced the Ohio Supreme Court to appoint another judge. While being charged with aggravated robbery, and kidnapping, among other things, Williams was facing a maximum consecutive sentence of 134 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Russo kept asking Williams to stop talking, but Franklin felt a bigger need to keep sharing what he had to say on the record than to actually do what the judge was asking him to. The judge kept telling him to zip it, but nobody expected it to be so literal.
This point, I'm going to hear from your lawyers, and that means zip it.
Russo ended up asking the officers to duct tape Williams' mouth and keep him silent while he hears from his lawyers. Russo then sentenced Williams to 24 years. But obviously, the video and images of Williams with the duct tape on his mouth went viral right away. Franklin, as well as several civil rights groups and associations, insisted that it was humiliating and unprecedented. So, upon such a controversy, Russo recused himself from the case, and another judge was appointed by the Supreme Court, and the new judge ended up sentencing him to 33 years. Number 7. Anthony Rodriguez Sentence. Anthony Rodriguez broke down in tears when he heard the judge giving him a new sentencing. This time, his victim, a 25-year-old woman. The crime took place in Kern County, California. At the time the police apprehended him, the juvenile and presumed suspect was on probation, which means he had already faced the justice system at an even younger age than this time. The prior charges he already faced were totally different from these new ones, and the new charges the 17-year-old is being accused of now are drastically more serious. The prosecutor and investigators are now looking to add to his criminal record rape, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Upon investigating, prosecutors say he dragged the 25-year-old woman for over 100 feet before assaulting her. From outside Martin Luther King Park, he forced her into the park's men's bathroom. After DNA evidence linked him to the crime scene, the 17-year-old was found guilty of all charges, and the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison to life, without parole. Rodriguez broke down in tears when hearing the sentencing and started yelling in the court that it was unfair. Number 6. Man acts insane. So many people are still hesitant when it comes to believing whether or not this man is acting or if he's for real. From the moment he entered the court, he appeared with an almost constant weird head shaking and his lips wide open while paying attention to what the judge was saying. And almost as constant as the head shaking, the growling. Mr. Jones was kept standing in front of the judge to hear about the new charges he'll be facing. He's being accused of murder and weapon possession during a violent crime. When the judge asked him if he understood the charges, he answered yes. When he was asked if he had the income to hire an attorney on his own, he answered, "Does it look like it? Fucking damn it!" And then he took an air bite. The growling started to get louder, and when the judge asked him if he preferred to hire his own attorney or get a public one, he answered, "I don't care."
I don't care.
While all this shaking, growling, and air biting lasted most of the time, it seemed that it only stopped when he was writing down his initials and signing the documents that the judge asked him to. Number 4. Man given 6 years after yelling at judge during sentencing for home invasion. A man from Lake County had 6 years added to his sentence because of how he reacted. Yikes. Manson Bryant was no stranger to being in a court. He's been in prison 3 times. Maybe that's why he snapped. But at the time of being sentenced for his latest misdemeanor, he lost his mind, unleashing a rampant, aggressive rant that was riddled with expletives. The judge was rightfully so insulted that he decided to add an extra 6 years to the sentence that he was gonna give to Bryant. He really should not have reacted, that's clear. Number 5. Mom's reaction. As the judge read out loud Keandra Cook's sentencing, it devastated her mother, bringing her uncontrollably down to tears. The 17-year-old teen and her boyfriend, Kendrick Bass, seemed to have a plan. The idea was to presumably lure the 27-year-old Perry Nita into meeting her in South Daytona. Once there, she would buy cannabis and sleep with him. But as Nita and Keandra just met online, Nita decided to bring along with him Emmanuel Purcell for the ride. Once Keandra got into the car, she faked having to go get money for a second, and when she came back to the car, her boyfriend, Bass, with a mask on, slipped into the back seat of the truck. But as apparently they were not expecting to find Emmanuel Purcell also in the back seat, the plan went totally sideways for him. Purcell pushed Keandra's boyfriend out of the truck, but since he had a gun, Bass ended up shooting the 17-year-old Purcell in the stomach. Luckily, as only one shot was fired and Purcell managed to get to the hospital in time, he survived. So for carjacking and battery, the judge sentenced Keandra to 20 years in prison, which completely brought her and her mother to tears. Number 3. Victim's father attacks killer. When a parent faces their kid's murderer, there's little room for imagination when it comes to what that parent has in mind at that moment. Van Terry had his daughter taken away by a convicted sex offender and murderer, Michael Madison. Already convicted in 2002 to 4 years of prison and classified as a sex offender for attempted rape, the criminal had also killed 3 women before between October 2012 and July 2013, among them Terry's daughter. And while sharing his victim impact statement, Terry looked back at Madison. Already so far away from showing any remorse whatsoever, the murderer kept looking at the father with an evil smirk. As Terry didn't even flinch, he stared back at Madison, and as unexpected as it was for everyone in the courtroom, Terry takes a quick step towards the criminal and jumps over the table to attack his daughter's killer with his bare hands. The court officers had to drag Terry out of the courtroom, causing about 15 minutes delay in the hearing sessions. And while the prosecutors were pleading for the death sentence, the defense attorneys were pleading for his life by focusing on the physical and psychological abuse history Madison had to go through during his childhood. But the judge ruled in favor of the death sentence. Number 2. Man who killed 6-year-old in DUI crash cries during sentencing. 2 years after the fatal DUI crash he had caused, the 22-year-old Jordan Fuss broke down in tears in court. In 2014, CCTV footage clearly captured Fuss in his Infiniti sports car going at more than 100 miles an hour. While driving at that speed and being under the influence of alcohol, he crashed into another car so violently that it even split in half. But material losses are the least of our worries, and that's definitely not why Fuss couldn't stop crying during his sentencing. During the crash, he unfortunately killed a 6-year-old sitting in the back seat. The mother and the sister survived, but Santiago died a few moments later at the hospital.
So sorry. I wish it was me.
"I'm sorry," Fuss repeated to the victim's family during his sentencing. "I wish it was me," he then added while breaking out in tears. "I would give my life if it meant bringing him back," Fuss said to the court. Santiago's parents couldn't accept his apology after losing their child in such a horrific event. "You didn't just take my son's life," said the devastated father. "You took mine too." The 22-year-old was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Number 1. Too drunk to care. Kayla Mendoza wasn't even legally allowed to drink when she tweeted, "Too drunk to care." Not only that, a few hours of drinking after that tweet, she drove to the Sawgrass Expressway, and she drove the wrong way. She was going at 80 miles per hour. While being under the influence, Mendoza crashed with another car head-on. In the other car were 2 21-year-old best friends, Caitlin Ferranti and Marissa Catronio. Catronio died at the scene of the crash, while Ferranti died several days after that, and Mendoza was hospitalized for several weeks after breaking her legs. According to court reports, at the time of the crash, Mendoza had blood alcohol levels of 0.15. They also found traces of marijuana in her system. With all these aggravating circumstances and the abundance of evidence of her own wrongdoing, Mendoza pleaded guilty to both counts of driving under the influence and manslaughter. The judge sentenced the young driver to 24 years in prison, revoked her driver's license, and ordered her to pay the cost of both the prosecution and the investigation. As you can see, teenagers are not always the little angels we wish them to be. In a world where violence seems to be rampant, they sometimes commit unspeakable crimes that we need to protect society from. But still, being as young as they are, do you think a life sentence for underage offenders should be lifted? Or do you think they're old enough to pay for their crimes as adults? Tell us about it. Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on screen right now. See you next time.